Here is a Hello, welcome to Walk in the Park. This is December 5th, 2018, episode 208. We're going to go take a look at some deltas. We're going to take a look at places where water meets land meets the water, where a river, in this case Taughannock Falls, Taughannock Creek, meets Cayuga Lake. And look what happens to the mud that's coming out of the creek there. Rivers have a lot of kinetic energy, and they can carry along mud and boulders and whatever, depending upon the amount of flow they have. And when they reach a body of water like a lake or the ocean, they run into it and they lose that kinetic energy and they dump whatever load they've got. So here is Taughannock Creek dumping its sediment into Cayuga Lake. And notice that the creek is channelized as it goes out into the lake through the little delta there, the point, Taughannock Point, little delta. If you look to the left, you can see that there is a boat basin there. That once was the mouth of Taughannock Creek, and over time the creek migrated over to the right before it was channelized by people who wanted to turn it into a park. And it was all wetlands and so forth before. Ithaca is the same way. The creeks that come into Ithaca have all been channelized, but the land that Ithaca, downtown Ithaca, is built on was built on delta material that was dumped into the south end of the Cayuga Lake for thousands of years, and filled it in, and it was all wetlands, and creeks could flow all over the place however they wanted. And but now it's channelized, and the creeks no longer deposit the soil that they brought down from the hills, the silt, in the wetlands, building up the land, but rather just pump it out into the lake, like you can see in Fall Creek in the left center, right in the center there, and then the big creek there is Cayuga Inlet after this heavy rain event here. But we're going to go take a look at the biggest delta in North America and see how some of the things look the same. And last week I was in New Orleans at a conference of the National Association for Interpretation, which is my professional association of park naturalists. There's my hat there. In historic site interpreters and so forth, people that interpret our natural and cultural heritage and have a profession doing so. So I went to New Orleans, where we had our annual conference, and we had a field trip going out to a park, which I'll show you now.
I hope this is more fun than when I spoke to the ethnobotanist. You know, there's only so many Linnaean jokes you can make. Something very interesting you really got.
Ranger Lucia. I'm going to be with you all morning. So to quickly go over the day, right now we're doing an orientation, and it is primarily going to be about the geography of the landscape and the ground, like the background ecology of the park. Then we're going to go out on a boat tour and see the swamps and bayous and freshwater marshes up close. After lunch, you guys are going to head out on the trail with Ranger Jack to talk more specifically about the layers and continuum of human history here at the park. Really offshoots of a larger river system that move really slow. In fact, sometimes you look at a bayou and it doesn't look like it's moving at all, but it's just moving at such a slow, imperceptible, because it's sort of like an offshoot of a faster moving body of water. Does that make sense?
It's not moving, it's just it's sound. It looks like a swamp.
Right. And then in just popular lingo, like the locals here, if they're going back down to where they live in Lafitte, where we're going next for the boat launch, they're going down to the swamps and marshes where they and many generations of their family have lived. So they say, we're going to go down the bayou. And if they come up to where you guys drove through with all the shopping malls and strip malls and subdivisions, they say, we're going up front to go shopping, because that's the opposite of down the bayou. But anyway.
Is there a difference between a bayou and canal? Like, when people use those terms?
Yes, so canals man-made, bio is natural. As everything that's happening to coastal Louisiana right now. There are three main reasons for that. There are many, many reasons for it. But I don't want to tell you things that you already know, so do any of you know any of those three reasons why we're experiencing all of this land loss, which, by the way, is over 2,000 square miles. If you smushed it all together, it's almost the size of the state of Rhode Island. So in coastal Louisiana, we've already lost a state's worth of land. And it will keep coming and keep happening. But why is it happening?
Sea level rise.
Sea level rise is one of the reasons, for sure. Yeah, we have global sea level rise. Similar to the San Francisco Bay Area and Boston, where we have these really old, this is an old city, we just had our tricentennial. We have really old tidal gauges down near Grand Isle and Port Fourchon. We have a tidal gauge that's been measuring water levels for a long time, and we have definitely experienced sea level rise here. We're going to talk about relative sea level rise in a minute, but we've already lost inches from the sea level rise. We're already having lots of issues here, and in absolute sea level rise, it's about 10 millimeters a year, with just crust rebounding and ocean getting warmer and expanding. But then we have relative sea level rise. So what else is happening besides sea level?
Erosion? Just erosion? Soil erosion? Erosion?
Yeah, so the sea level rise is causing soil erosion, right? So a river, a delta anywhere in the world is a conversation between a river and an ocean. And the voice of the river has been much diminished lately, which is one of the reasons. I'll get to that in a little while. And because of sea level rise, the voice of the ocean is getting much stronger. And even during large storm events, we are freshwater systems here, but we can get some slight salinity coming in from Barataria Bay in the south. Sorry, we're right here. Should have said that already. Okay.
More violent storms.
Land sinking. Why is the land sinking though?
Taking the oil out and
Building.
Canals.
Development?
Some of it, the weight of some of
Not
it.
being replenished.
It's not being replenished. Why is it not being replenished?
Canals.
Controlled, and the sediment's not allowed to flow into
Yeah.
your building.
Right.
Yeah. In 1927, we had the Great Flood, all the way from the Midwest down to Louisiana. Catastrophic loss of life and property. Right after that, the Army Corps of Engineers was created because we want, never again is what everyone said. This is not going to happen again. We're going to be prepared. And so even though 300 years ago when they built tiny levees, but when the Army Corps of Engineers started getting involved more and more, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the entire Mississippi River, which comes out right here, is levied all the way up past this map, pretty much right past the city of Baton Rouge to what's called the Old River Control Structure. So this is these big high green hills and usually some sort of concrete anchoring or multi-use trail from here all the way to Baton Rouge, which is over an hour's drive from here. So basically the river has been put into a straitjacket, and that water and the sediment that built this land is no longer available to replenish it. So a delta is a naturally heavy place, right? John McPhee described the Mississippi Delta here as half a mile of mountain butter. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of feet of just mud. There are no rocks here. You will not find a rock in southern Louisiana. It's all mud and sand, okay? And it's naturally heavy, but if it's not getting replenished, then it keeps sinking. So then when you have the sea level rise and the subsidence, this is the technical term for the sinking, then you have a relative sea level rise where we're losing 1 to 2 centimeters per year, not just that 10 millimeters, because it's the difference between the two, if that makes sense. So then there's a third reason why we're experiencing such rapid wetlands loss, and it's a little bit more, I want to say one more thing about the Old River Control Structure. So you can see the only area that's growing land right now is the Atchafalaya Bay, okay? The reason for that is because you can see in that map behind you, the Mississippi River has had different growing lobes throughout its thousands and thousands of years of history. You can envision it almost like if it was like 1,000-year time-lapse photography, like a hose just spraying of its own because you're not controlling it, right? Building land as it goes along. But because the Port of New Orleans is here, and that is big business, we want to maintain flowing water going past the port for all of the large ships that are coming from the Midwest and from other countries that are going up and down the Mississippi River. So at the old river control structure, they forced 2/3 of the water to still keep going past the Port of New Orleans, and they allow the other third of the water to naturally just go to the Atchafalaya Bay. Because if we weren't controlling the river, it would have already switched course. This arm would start dying, and this arm would be the new growing lobe. Okay, so the third reason has to do with an important,
I have a question about
Yeah.
that. Even with logic, of course, I don't have this kind of hydrological logic, but
the highest ground is the ground. You have to think the opposite of anything. Delta is like bizarro world. Opposites are here. So, like, I live only about 3 blocks from the Mississippi River. And when I first told my mom that, when I moved here, she was freaked out. She's like, it's going to flood, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, that's the highest ground. The highest ground is near the river. That's where the plantations were built. That's where the first cities and homes were built, because that is the highest ground, and then it slopes off away from the river. Bizarro world, I know.
that is.
But that's what it is.
Is that due to the sediments being laid
Yes.
down
Right.
from the river?
Water seeks its level, you would think, but it would be the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
Not in a delta.
Bizarre.
Yeah.
So the other issue that's leading to all this wetlands loss has to do with all these spider webs of man-made canals that are all through here. You can see them. So what is that from? It's a big business in Louisiana.
Oil,
What?
oil.
Oil and natural gas exploration. So there are tens of thousands of miles of oil and gas exploration pipeline. It continues all the way across the Chenier Plains for the whole state into coastal Texas. And people in Louisiana do not badmouth the oil and gas industry. It has, like, the people who live down in Lafitte, they, like our Gateway community, they generally are shrimpers. And a lot of them work in the oil and gas industry offshore. They'll go out for a month, a couple weeks, come back and forth. And especially for folks that were in poverty of Cajun ancestry, it was an amazing way to get into middle and upper classes in this state. And they came in early. They were here in the 50s. They were producing before we even had the environmental laws of the early 70s. So a lot of these canals were created before there were laws about mitigating for habitat that you destroy even. So they're not on the hook for fixing that tens of thousands of miles of these exploratory canals and keyhole cuts and everything. Also, as you're taking gases and liquids out of the ground, it sinks faster. And thirdly, it exacerbates that whole erosion saltwater thing because it has these straight, marshes, whether it be the freshwater marshes up in here, down to the salt marshes in here, are meant to be sheet flow, flowing slowly across the top of the land. The canals allow water to move quickly through the middle of the land, and so more salt can come further up in a freshwater system than it should have normally because of all those oil and gas canals.
I don't get the logic of that. It doesn't make sense.
It's moving slowly over the top
Okay.
with vegetation versus having a cut right here. You can just go straight up it for water, at least.
Oh, well, you're not talking about drainage down.
I'm talking about up.
Oh, okay, that's.
Yeah. Salt water going up. So all these cool colors are wetlands loss. Barataria Bay is really affected. The state is well aware of this. Everybody who lives in Louisiana is aware of the wetlands loss in Louisiana. They call it the working coast, as I mentioned before. People also recreate off of this land. We are preserved status in the national park system, so we actually had a permitted hunting season. Oh, and I should say about the oil and gas, we own the surface land, we do not own the mineral rights. So we still have grandfathered canals that folks like Chevron, Shell, others keep open in the park. They never had high production. This site, maybe out in Lake Salvador, but like right here, there was never like a big find of oil and gas deposit. But they keep the canals open because they want to have access to other areas for in case. And we have to allow that because we don't own the land underneath us. We only own the land on top. It happens in more national parks, wildlife refuges than you would think.
Can you point out where we are?
Yeah, we're right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're not down in that area, right?
No, but it's getting uncomfortably close. The state of Louisiana has a coastal master plan. They tried to make it really easy to digest and understand. It's 50 prioritized projects for at least $50 billion over the next 50 years. And the only reason they have money to start some of these projects, and one of the first will be called the Mid-Barataria Bay Sediment Diversion. It'll be right about here, and it'll start filling in and growing these wetlands here, hopefully, and giving us some more natural barriers so those warm colors don't keep coming up into where we are here. The agency at the state level that controls all that is called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. And so they're concerned about stopping flooding, levees and stuff like that, but they're also concerned about restoration. So, which kind of like the Park Service, it's sort of two missions that go together but don't go together. But they are actively working to do not only restoration down here with barrier islands, oyster reefs, to have your first line of defense, to start allowing the river to do what it is meant to do, allow sediment and water diversions, help building land, and also just some smaller restoration projects with like cypress plantings or marsh grass plantings, things like that. And they have money to start these projects right now, unfortunately, because of the BP oil spill. The Restore Act set aside a certain amount of money from the settlement for the 5 Gulf states that were affected, and Louisiana got the largest chunk of that.
Which is now cut off and changed if there's a future oil spill.
Right.
Yeah.
So, say that again?
Yeah.
So they changed it recently with this administration to say if there is another oil spill, the gas and oil companies will not be charged.
Where? He's on the top.
It's on the, my God, what she said, the size of that sucker. I'm looking down at the water. Oh, look at that.
He's thinking, oh, you again.
Okay, how am I gonna
Remember how folks work. So,
Anyone want to get a picture?
I love it.
Oh, you've seen?
You got a little one. A little one.
Also shows where the high ground is in relation to the low ground. And we're starting here on high ground, then we're going to be going to low ground. We're going from natural levee to swamp to marsh. Louis, you might have already mentioned what those terms were earlier today, right? So right now we're on a natural levee, which is what the word for high ground. There's always high ground next to waterways, and there's a waterway across the highway by day for me. So this is the high ground next to that waterway. And as soon as we make this bend, we'll be starting to go downhill into the swamp. And this trail ends at the marsh. Now the other trail we're going to go on does not go to the marsh because that's the part of the trail that's closed. That's where the mama gator is. So we can go on this trail to see the marsh and maybe see some gators. And then we're going to take the bus to the other parking lot. On the back step where the high ground goes down to the swamp, and the creek will go straight up or go outside the creek and they draw the swamp. So the biggest trees out here are bald cypress trees. Those are the most common trees. That's why these are called cypress swamps. Now, bald cypress trees do not belong to the cypress family of trees. I'm not even sure why they're called cypress trees. They actually belong to the redwood family of trees. And they can be half as tall as a redwood tree. They can be 150 feet tall, 15 stories high, which is probably higher than any building here on the West Bank. And there's some hotels, hospitals, which are pretty big. And I believe neither of those are actually 15 stories high. So these trees would have been the highest objects here. There's very few tall trees left because when these cypress trees are hundreds of years old, they make for very good rot-resistant wood, so most have been cut down for lumber. About 100 years ago, they cut down most of the trees in the swamp. So even though these trees might look pretty big, they're only about 100 years old. We can see a lot bigger trees when we get to the other parking lot, to the other trail. And you also notice the little pieces of wood come out of the ground. Those are called cypress knees. Those are part of the root of a cypress tree. Those are not new trees coming out. So the roots go into the ground, they come above ground, they go in the ground, come above ground. Now they could be used to get nutrients from the air, since they stick above the water. We believe they could also be used to hold a tree in place because there's no rocks to hold these trees in place. The rocks are hundreds of feet beneath us. We need all the silt deposited by the floodwaters over the centuries when the rivers overflow the banks. Hurricane Katrina and Rita back in 2005 damaged half the trees in this park, but not one cypress tree was actually toppled over by the hurricane. We think it's because the cypress knees helped to hold these big trees in place. We're going to be walking through cypress forest for most of the way until we get to where the swamp begins. And also be looking out for some alligators if we see them along the way. We get very close.
So it's not cattails?
No, not this particular plant, no.
So the ones that did have the cattail, you do have cattails in here,
We do have
right?
cattails in the park, yeah, but these are actually cut grass.
Cut grass, okay. Because it'll cut you.
Oh, yes.
All right.
So this is where the trail is going to end because if it's hard for trees to go on the marsh and hard to build a trail in the marsh, you got to put the pillars down, 20 or 30 feet to build a trail in the marsh. Because the water could be a couple feet deep here. Now I've actually walked out here on the marsh. It's just soil floating on water. You can do that. I was wearing hip waders just in case I fell in. I actually walked out to the tree line out there. And there's trees out there because there's a spoil bank. There's a man-made canal out there. And when you build a canal, you dump the ground out to the side, just high enough ground for trees to grow. Spoil bank. When we walk on the Bayou-Coquille Trail, that also includes the Marsh Overlook Trail. And we walking next to a canal on a spoil bank on that trail. So this is basically what most of the park is marsh. Beyond the tree line, all you have is marsh. Most of the 30,000 acres of this park is marsh, and it's just hard to build trails in the marsh. So unless you have hip waders, it's kind of hard to walk beyond this point. So we're going to go back to the parking lot.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm about to stick my camera right into your way.
Oh, that's part of the whole picture.
Is it? That's what you get. You get that, eh?
They lunged out of the water like several feet in the air. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be in the way of them there. Ooh.
I saw that when I was little living in Florida, and no one believed me. They were like, "Oh, they can't lunge out of the water. They can't jump."
And the word bayou comes from the Choctaw Indian word bayak, which just means stream or creek. And the French began to pronounce the word bayak as bayou. I guess it sounds more French that way, so now they're called bayous. So just a stream or a creek. You don't really see water flowing here, because these waterways are no longer connected to the Mississippi because of man-made levees. And the land is so flat, there's no hill for the water to flow down. So the water's pretty still, unless we have a hurricane or a tropical storm. If water gets pushed into the park by hurricane, like Hurricane Harvey last year, pushed water into the park. Even though it hit Texas, it pushed water into the park. We had to close the trails down for a week because the trails were underwater and there were alligators swimming above the trails. And they were hissing at our maintenance men because we were invading their territory, which is water. We got to close trails down when that happens. Otherwise, the water is pretty still in these waterways. And so are the animals that live here. There's at least 2 alligators in this bayou, which we may or may not see as we walk down this trail. They can be very well hidden sometimes, but they're there.
There are always those people on trails on tours that stay away.
Covering material goods in the Napoleonic Wars. He was also a slave trader. He smuggled slaves to this area. Because the high ground here and the high ground in town, the natural levee, were being used as sugar plantations. Most of the garden district used to be sugar plantations. Worst place for a slave 200 years ago. They're pretty much being worked to death. By the time they're 30, they're dead. They're just being worked to death. Slave owners did not have a problem with that. They could always get more slaves from Africa to replace the ones who were working to death. Until the year 1808, when the U.S. Congress abolished the African slave trade, which meant that slavery is still legal, but you can no longer legally bring slaves here from Africa. So now the slave owners are getting desperate. How do we replace the ones who are working to death? That's when Lafitte noticed that Spain was still bringing slaves from Africa to Cuba, so his men went out into the Caribbean and stole the slaves from the Spanish. They didn't pay for them. And that meant they could sell them for a very cheap price. So Lafitte is very popular among the slave owners, but not among the law because they're all trying to arrest him. And this map shows his smuggling routes, which are basically waterways, not too many roads back then. If he brought the slaves into town, he'd get arrested. But if he sells them out here where we are, he can always make a quick getaway because he knows the way around. And the people trying to catch him would get lost out here. And this is why the park is named after him. Because I talked to the guy who named this park, Frank Aird, who just passed away a couple years ago. He was in his 90s. When he was a young man back in the 1930s, he spent a lot of time down here where we are right now. And ex-slaves who were still alive at that time, and they must have been in the 90s by the 1930s, they told Frank Aird that according to their oral history, right here along this bayou, there used to be these mounds of shells, which Lafitte used as mounds to auction off slaves. So Frank Aird here, he starts in the 1930s. By the 1960s, people are talking about doing here what they were doing to the suburbs just north of here, which is to drain out the swamp to build houses. And that's when he began to push to make this to a park. And first he just thinking state park. He wants to call it John Lafitte State Park because Lafitte was here. And then when this became a national park, it kept the same name, John Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve. So this national park is named after somebody who brought slaves here who be worked to death in 10 years on these plantations. Cypress Swamp, most of these are cypress trees. As I mentioned before, they get to be pretty big. They can be 150 feet tall, but most have been cut down for the lumber. But the one back there was not cut down for the lumber when the rest were cut down 100 years ago. And that gives you an idea of how big those trees can be. And a big heavy tree like that needs something to hold it up, and that's the reason for the cypress knees, since there's no rocks to hold the roots in the ground. Now in between the cypress knees, the little pieces would come up. Sometimes ground kind of gathers there. And that's probably where maroon communities were before the Civil War. The word maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means runaway. Because the French were the first Europeans here, then came the Spanish. The French brought a few slaves. The Spanish brought a lot of slaves here. So when you have a lot of slaves, you have a lot of slaves escaping away from the sugar plantation where they're being worked to death. So some of the slaves that Lafitte would have brought here and sold to the plantation owners might have escaped into the swamps. And many times the owners do not even try to look for them because they might be killed by a snake or an alligator out here. But many survive and form what are called maroon communities on a little bit of high ground in between those cypress knees. So there is a gator here in the water just beyond this barrier. And the trail is closed here because beyond this is where the mama gator is.
Oh, this is the one that closed with the mama gator.
Oh yeah, that's what it is.
I don't know if that's the mama.
No, he said it's not.
He said, okay.
Oh, it's right there. It just went down.
Is a